Richard McPherson, how are you?
I'm great this morning. How are you?
I'm doing swimmingly. Listen, man, this is going to be one of many, and I'm really excited to kick this off. You have been engaged in the nuclear energy production world for near 6 decades. Starting in armed services in the Navy, moving all the way through world conversations, world industry. Now you and I happen to live about 10 minutes apart, and we got connected. And the real goal of our collaboration here, as long as you're willing to keep coming in, is to provide nuclear education to Idaho and the United States that is not present anywhere else.
As far as I know, that's absolutely correct. We've tried to do it before. I've tried to do it before. Other people have tried to do it before, but it's never gotten to be a serious subject with the nuclear community like it should have been.
Well, I recently I got very interested in nuclear for a number of reasons. I was very fortunate to go on a tour in Idaho National Labs. Like I'm looking at cool stuff. I'm like, great, but I don't know anything about it, and I don't know that there's a way for me to understand it, right? And that's really what drove me to get connected with you. But just having, a rudimentary understanding, we need more than that, right? I think people understand the nature of coal production. I don't think people understand the technology behind solar production, but they understand you put a panel in front of a sun and it makes power.
Yeah.
Wind generation makes sense. Geothermal for the most part makes sense. Hydro makes sense. You drop things down and spin a turbine. But nuclear, although fundamentally it is very basic. You create a heat source, you get expansion, you spin a turbine with that, and rinse and repeat. It's very technical, and it's something that obviously people are concerned about. So today you're in charge of the curriculum, but the idea is, hey, look, let's just get some history leading up to how Idaho has become kind of a nuclear national research hub and leader.
Okay, and I think
let me pull this microphone a little bit closer, if you wouldn't mind.
So I think that if you look at the complexity of nuclear, it's the anti-nuclear industry, and I'll talk about that a little later, that has caused it to seem so complex because they want people to think it's not safe. And they use 3 different accidents or incidents to prove that time and time and time again. They use the 3 Mile Island accident. They call it an accident. They use Chernobyl in Ukraine. And they use in Japan, when a tidal wave hit a nuclear power plant there called Fukushima Daiichi. And they continue to use those to scare people. The other thing that they use to scare people is they go back to the early days of nuclear weapons development and the early days of the use of radionuclides starting in the 1940s and 50s and perhaps going into the 60s, when we've had some exposures of people due to various reasons, some of which were the workers themselves, some of which were winds that were blowing away from nuclear weapons development, and people got exposed. So they use all of that to scare people about commercial nuclear power today, and it's unjustified, it's unfounded.
And again, although there is a very clear, even in these examples, there's a clear cost that people point to, loss of life or health or something like that. There's no other electrical generation source that doesn't have damage as well, either readily apparent immediately or the inherent cost that, people, especially environmental types, very much like to point to, which is long-term cost of adding incredible amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. So it's kind of like, look, pick your poison. There's no, let's just be clear. Yeah, no one's perfect, but these are also technologies and accidents that were, from a bygone era. I mean, we have like iPhones now and stuff.
Well, so you brought up coal. Coal from mining to usage of the coal in a power plant, it has emissions, and we have spent in the United States. We have spent billions of dollars to clean up those emissions coming out of a coal-fired power plant. Sometime later, we'll go over the 1985 Clean Coal Technology Demonstration Program that the U.S. Department of Energy put together. So once I read it and understood it, I got behind it. So my nuclear friends thought I jumped the fence. And I said, you don't remember. I'm an all energy but guy. So all energy is every natural resource we have. Every natural energy resource we have, we must exploit it to its highest and best economical use. And that's been my position since probably the late 60s, early 70s, once I realized about all energy.
Okay. Staying on track here, history of nuclear. Obviously, we have, the atomic question in World War II, and then coming out of that, hey, how can we use this technology not outside of wartime for better prosperity worldwide?
Right.
Start from there.
Start from there, or I'd like to go back.
Go back.
A little
Go
bit.
wherever you want.
And I'd like to go back a little bit because it'll pave the way to where we are in nuclear today,
Right.
or we aren't in nuclear today. So in 1849, in California, they discovered gold. In 1849, in Pennsylvania, they discovered oil. So oil suddenly became something that everybody was looking at for lots of different uses, not the least of which they could burn it similar to what they burned coal. So by the late 1800s, oil was being refined into usable products. The U.S. Navy started experimenting with oil-fired boilers in the late 1800s. But they didn't build their first ships that were oil-fired until during the middle of World War I. And World War I is what made the difference in the world for petroleum. It's also a time which we rapidly shifted from coal for ships to oil. The British were slightly ahead of the Navy in actually building the ships, I think, but we shifted from coal to oil. Coal continued to be used as a power source for boilers for putting out electricity. But we had gone to oil, and so along comes World War I. What did we do in World War I except fight a war? Well, we did something else. We taught a lot of young people how to drive an airplane, drive a vehicle, or drive a ship. And that was the big surge in the use of petroleum. And some people will call it that is the war, that is the time that petroleum came of age. Now, we don't have to go, we have to go about 20 years later, we got World War II. World War II, the United States was drawn into it on December 7th, 1941, both in Europe and in the Pacific against Japan. That is the war that the petroleum industry in the United States had increased the availability of fuels from oil, had increased the capacity of being able to take crude oil out of the ground and make petroleum fuels out of it. It was the United States that fed our allies fuel so that we could win World War II. Mm. And once again, we taught a whole bunch of young men and women how to drive airplanes, how to drive vehicles, and how to drive ships. And after World War II, everybody wanted a vehicle. And there was the rapid rise in the automobile industry.
Gotcha. Okay, and previous to that, I mean, Ford obviously and Chrysler had been around, but, coming out of World War II, this is when people came back. This was the greatest generation, right, where people came back. You had, high-quality jobs. Everybody was being told to reproduce, make big families, Sara Lee cake and, Chevrolet kind of thing. But that's the time you're talking about, right?
Yeah, the guys came back from the war. Men and women came back from the war. They wanted families, they wanted children, they wanted an education, they wanted to travel. They took advantage of the freedoms this country has to travel and go see it. That also really started the vacation industry. That started the chains of hotels. That started the destination resorts. Everything like that really got a big jump up right after World War II for the next 10 years.
Gotcha. And it was the 40 years preceding it, it was the availability of energy that really drove that.
There was availability of energy because even though we had the Great Depression, even though we had the Dust Bowls, the oil companies were still learning how to refine and make a better slate of products.
Gotcha.
So there wasn't the money that was available, there wasn't the impetus that was available, but the beginning of World War II provided both the money and the impetus for them to take what they had learned to date and significantly increase the rate of production of crude oil into a slate of products that could be used for lubrication and could be used for fueling various engines. But that's also the time in World War II, right at the beginning of World War II, that the first fission occurred in Chicago, at the University of Chicago under a stadium. And the people who did that, I actually met one of them who later on became president of General Atomics in San Diego. And what an interesting guy to listen to. I also had lunch one time with Ed Teller, and that was a very interesting lunch. So early on, I met guys who had started the nuclear industry. During World War II, or early part of World War II, when they had that fission that went on underneath the university, they proved that they could use thermal neutrons. They proved that they could control them. So we made it so that instantly became part of the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was to produce nuclear weapons. But you can't produce the fuel for nuclear weapons unless you have a nuclear reactor to produce the fuel. So nobody talks about it much, but the real history of nuclear energy we have today was proven during World War II with the two reactors that were made during World War II. And they operated safely. Now, everything around them, everybody was still learning about the handling and everything that goes along with radionuclides. That was still in its infancy. So we had a big steep learning curve. And like anything else that you start to deal with that's toxic, you have people that get exposed to it. They're harmed by it. It's a part of the natural process. It's not that somebody went out of their way to do it. It's just part of the natural process. And you can take a look at the chemicals we have today that are far more dangerous than nuclear power ever thought of being. But it's a process, and we've learned how to deal with those. And a big part of that was learning how to deal with chemicals in the chemical industry that was spawned by the use of petroleum because of World War I.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
This is something that I didn't really understand even when I was going through INL. When you talk about, hey, look, to get nuclear fuels, we need a nuclear reactor, right? And my mind instantly goes to like, something out of The Simpsons with like giant, cooling towers. But essentially what that means is that you have fuel rods, and the fuel rods themselves are built of material that if you fire a neutron into them, they will produce 2 or 3 neutrons, right?
Well, let me hold you up right there.
Okay.
So we don't need a nuclear reactor to provide fuel.
Okay.
We dig fuel out of the ground. We make something that's called the front end of the fuel cycle.
Okay.
We make something called yellow cake. We turn that into gas, and then we turn it into enriched fuel to put in nuclear reactors.
Okay.
What you just got into was the control rods that control the rate of fissioning of a reactor, the reactivity control system. And what those rods are made out of material that happens to suck up neutrons. They absorb neutrons and keep them. So they are not needed to make fuel, except we got started early on during World War II, and the first reactor that went critical in the United States was right here in Idaho, EBR-1, like experimental breeder reactor number 1. That did breed new fuel. So we can breed new fuel from use of uranium with other uranium, or we can do it with thorium. People think that thorium is a fuel. Thorium is not a fuel. Thorium is something that can be turned into a fuel by putting it into a reactor and exposing it to fission process. And we turn thorium into uranium-233. Okay.
So bottom line is, when you say we need a reactor to create the pieces for, let's say, a bomb, the reactor is literally just having either plutonium, uranium, or something in a critical state where it's producing lots and lots and lots of neutrons, and you can put things into that reactor in the same proximity of that reactor and change them, right? Thorium, for instance, and that can kick off fuel. So the breeder fuel is like, hey, we had a nuclear reaction going. We had this material that was in close enough proximity in the right environment that it was controlled. Everything was safe. You either have 4 feet of concrete, lead, or water, whatever you need to do to make it safe. But we had this reaction going, and then we would put things into there and it would kick off fuel. It would breed fuel.
We could breed fuel.
There you go.
Now, under the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter somehow felt as though if we don't breed fuel, if we don't have breeder reactors, then nuclear weapons won't proliferate. He also had another theory in his mind that if we don't reprocess spent commercial fuel, then nuclear weapons won't proliferate. Both cases, he was wrong. We all knew he was wrong. He knew he was wrong, but he had an agenda that was helped along by what happened right after Dwight D. Eisenhower gave his speech on December the 8th, 1953 at the United Nations. His speech was entitled Atoms for Peace. Now you have to take a look at why did President Eisenhower do that. President Eisenhower was a graduate of West Point in 1915. The beginning of World War I. He did not deploy during World War I. He got into the logistics arena in the Army, and he started begin to understand the importance of logistics to support the Army wherever it may be in the world. So he had a really good training ground during World War I. Time passes, and he believes so much in logistics and transporting things that he was asked to put together a convoy, and he put together a convoy of trucks that went from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to see what it took to get across country. That was very revealing to him. That helped him during World War II. When he became president, that knowledge became the basis of the interstate highway system we have today. But more to his education was he'd been through 2 world wars. He, like all the rest of us that have been to war, don't like wars. And he had the benefit. He became president, I think, in 1953, January 53, I think. He had the benefit of 2 things that happened here in Idaho. In 1951, EBR-1 went critical, made power. In early 1953, the first submarine reactor by Captain Rickover went critical here in Idaho and made power. Admiral Rickover, or Captain Rickover then, in November of 1948, signed the first contract with Westinghouse to design and build that reactor. So President Eisenhower also had the benefit of the Korean War. Korean War, which started in June of 1950, ended in 1953. So he was a president with a ton of knowledge. And he knew that commercial nuclear power would help not just the United States, but the rest of the world for peace and prosperity. So that's why he went up and gave his speech at the United Nations on December the 8th, 1953. The Soviet Union could not allow the United States to have commercial nuclear power.
Why?
Because they'd seen us go out and win World War I. Then they had seen, because of our industrial capacity, easily gear up and go out and win World War II. The Soviet Union wanted to take over the world. The communists wanted to take over the world. The communists are dedicated to being in control of people, dictatorships. And they started putting money into the United States. The Communist Party of the United States was formed in 1919. And it was very effective, but slowly. After his speech, the Soviet Union started pouring money in here to change people's minds about nuclear power, because they did not want nuclear power to be what it could become. So they put enough money in here, and they created a whole new industry in the United States, which we commonly call the anti-nuclear industry. But what it has become, it's become an industry of activists for anything that people want to pay them to do. It's gotten to be a whole industry unto itself. And today, even on the internet, people advertise that they will put together an activist organization for you to show up anywhere at any time.
That's in a very contemporary, real way going on. I mean,
Yes,
like we see
today.
you can see it on TikTok, you can see it on Instagram, you can see, my brother-in-law is a law enforcement officer down in the state that shall not be named. And in the early 2010s, there was a lot of unrest with Occupy movements and whatnot, and specifically in Berkeley, where he works. And there were busloads of people coming from out of the area that had no connection to Berkeley. They had no connection to, and they were literally getting transported on buses, and the law enforcement in the various areas were like, okay, you got 3 buses headed your way. Like this was their collection point. People wearing masks and complete anarchy, and they were showing up, and then they'd get on the buses and go home. They had no connection to the area. They were there literally just to, drive cars through Walgreens storefronts, which was happening, and light things on fire, which again was happening. So, when you talk about this, like I've been aware of this for, a decade and a half. And again, I'm not saying I'm some big historian, but it tracks completely with what we're seeing in our contemporary communities.
Sure. Well, we didn't see it at first, but for people in the intelligence community who were keeping track of this, they saw it, but it wasn't very public. Now, I had gone into the Navy, and I was on nuclear submarines, and I was a nuclear power plant operator by that time. So I started getting attuned to all this external events that were being created to stop nuclear power. Well, since I'd been through nuclear power school and I qualified on my first reactor in Idaho, and I was qualified on my second reactor undersea on a fleet ballistic missile submarine, I was sitting there saying to myself, what's wrong with us? Nuclear power is the way to go. And I think that was probably 1967. I was qualified as a lower level engine room watch. It's a lonely place. It's cool. It's quiet. Well, it's sort of quiet. You got 2 turbines there. But I'm thinking to myself, with what I know that nuclear power is great. Why don't we have nuclear power everywhere? So a couple of things, in addition to that dawning on me, it also dawned on me that I had become a student of energy in 1957. My father was a naval aviator stationed at Barbers Point Naval Air Station on the island of Oahu, territory of Hawaii. It wasn't a state yet. So one day I asked my dad, I said, where do you get the gas for your airplane? He said, it comes in a truck. I said, well, where does that truck get its gas? He said, well, there's a tank on Barbers Point, and he fills it up, brings it to our airplane. I said, where does that tank get its gas? He said, well, there are 2 pipelines. One comes from Pearl Harbor, one comes from downtown Honolulu Harbor. And I said, where do they get their gas? He said, well, they've got tanks there. And he said, they have tankers that come in from Los Angeles and San Francisco. And he drew on a white sheet of paper for me this chain of starting at the refineries in Los Angeles and San Francisco, going into tankers, coming over to Hawaii, coming in Honolulu Harbor, coming in Pearl Harbor, and they deposit their fuel there. The fuel is stored there, and then it's pumped over to Barbers Point, into a tank, into a truck, into my dad's airplane. So I really wish I had that sheet of paper. Now, what I didn't know until 10 years later, I had become a student of energy in 1957. In reality, I'm still a student of energy. Forget about all the power plants I've operated or I've been on or done whatever I've done. I'm still a student of energy. And it's a fascinating field.
To that end, again, just since I met you a week ago, I've been, really trying to wrap my head around this. When we talk about energy in our contemporary energy production, I remember reading an article years ago about a solar farm in Germany. And essentially what the solar farm did is it reflected sunlight onto a giant center concrete block, right? And within the concrete block, there was a bunch of water piping that went through. And essentially all of the solar farm, the circular thing, focused all of the energy onto the concrete. The water heated up and it spun a turbine, right? So that's one source of energy, reflecting the light. There were also other examples of solar farms where they had U-shape mirrors that focused on a central pipeline. That central pipeline with heating oil heated up to like 700 degrees, got to a boiling point. You just pump that oil in. Essentially, my Weber barbecue. You get a bunch of coal. You can hold the coal in your hand. Nothing happens. You can try to light that thing on fire. Nothing happens, right? You have to get the coal arranged in the right position and then get the right Kickstarter for that coal. I use, the lighter fluid. Once it starts going, if the coals are too far apart, they die. They go out. But if you put everything just right, I like the pyramid, or, you get the chimney thing. But if you get the coal just right, it starts to react off of each other, right. And that's our fuel. So at the core of all of our energy production, I know there are like a wind turbine doesn't need a heat source, but at the core of a lot of our contemporary energy production is, can we get a heat source? What's the heat source? How do we harness this heat source? Can it be consistent? Can it be controllable? And what's the byproduct of the heat source? Obviously, if we're talking oil or coal, yeah, we know what the byproduct is. Everybody's worried about gases, right? Greenhouse gases. And with nuclear, it's like a big hunk of coal, like my Weber briquette, and you have to arrange it just right. But then you have this heat source, and that's it. So when you talk about going critical, that's literally at the point where I'm like, aha, there's heat coming off of the briquettes. I arranged them correctly. I put enough lighter fluid on it. I gave it enough oxygen, and now it's going.
Yeah.
If you don't do that correctly, the nuclear reactor will not go critical. Just like if you tried to light a bunch of briquettes either flat or not enough oxygen, or you didn't put enough lighter fluid, it just won't work. But there's a point of arrangement in chemistry where it's like, okay, now we're creating enough heat. We harness this heat. Nuclear thermal fission, or again, I'm going to screw up the vocabulary, but that's the nature of, hey, we now have energy, and it's just coming from this source.
And you're absolutely right. But I want to go back to a couple of examples you used. You used a tower with some mirrors in Germany.
Yes.
That was quite a while ago.
Yes.
So the Department of Energy, I don't know when it got started, but it was in the late 70s, I think, as I recall. And we built a similar tower to that in Barstow, California.
I hope it didn't have any clouds.
Solar One. Well, in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Yeah. The Mojave Desert is 300 days a year, of which it's got
right. Well, the reason I mentioned that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the one of the bigger problems, because I had a friend who was going to, getting his PhD in energy production and whatnot at the time, and when there's a cloudy day, intermittent clouds, they actually can't harness any of the energy.
That's correct.
Because what will happen is, if the mirrors are focused on the concrete and it's cloud cover, and then the cloud goes away, the concrete will heat up so fast it'll just blow up the whole thing. So if you have intermittent cloud cover on and off, you have to actually just turn the mirrors straight up, because you can't do anything, right? So anyway,
that's sort of what happens. But when you talk about concrete, the mirrors are actually focused on the top of the tower, where there's a big heat exchanger up there that's full of water. And they are focused on that to heat up the water, to create the steam, to drive a turbine, to drive a generator. So that has been duplicated in recent years in a couple places. One, Sandia National Laboratory has a test program with a tower down there. The other one is, there were two that were put in operation just west of Las Vegas. When you drive out of Las Vegas on the right-hand side against the mountains there, you'll see those mirrors all over the Mojave Desert, and they are focused on two towers there. So I won't go into all the details of my background in those two, but I will tell you that I was convinced early on that project would fail. That project has now been shut down after spending a couple $2 billion or more on it. So the focused mirrors sound good, but there are other issues associated with all of that. The other one that you talked about, where the mirrors are focused on a tube that goes through the middle of them, I think you're talking about, there is two projects. There's a project that got started in Mojave Desert also,
yes.
Along 395, just past a place called Four Corners, called Luz. And the Luz project is exactly that, where they have these concave mirrors, and concave or concave, I guess.
Concave.
And they are focused on this pipe that goes through them that's full of oil. And when they first built it, they had some problems, not with the mirrors, but they had some problems with the boiler that took that oil and converted it to steam and drove a turbine and drove a generator. So it burned down. The mirrored system that they had the first time there is dependent upon motors driving the mirrors as the sun passes from east to west. When in reality, there is a system that other people have developed since then to not have them driven by a motor, but having them driven by a thermal source itself to track the sun. So there are those systems also. Since you brought them both up, I thought I would mention them.
And again, both just designed, we need heat, right?
We need thermal energy.
There you go.
Thermal energy.
So you were saying the birth of the anti-nuclear movement spawned by international adversaries that saw our industrial capacity and our successes in the two world wars and were not interested in allowing that to continue propagating.
No. So by 1970, they were successful. Basically, from 1970 to today, we have had no progress in commercial nuclear industry. No progress. Now, we built a bunch of plants since then because they were already underway to be built. So the majority of the commercial nuclear power plants built in the United States were built between 1970 and 1980. They all came off of the first plant that was built, which was went in operation in 1957, which was actually a project which President Eisenhower asked Captain and later Admiral Rickover to get involved in. It was called Shipping Port. And that reactor was essentially built under the guidance of Naval Reactors, Admiral Rickover. From that time on, we started building two types of power plants, pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors, with the boiling water, with the two being generally characterized as light water reactors. So by 1970...
So again, that's just the category. Light water reactors, you have pressurized and you have steam.
You have pressurized and boiling water.
Great. And boiling water. And those are considered light water reactors. Great.
Those are both light water reactors. So at least I wasn't aware by 1970 that they'd been able to stop us. I originally put that date as 1979, which also we had a couple of things that happened in 1979. We had the TMI, 3 Mile Island incident, and we also had 3 weeks before the 3 Mile Island accident, we had a movie called The China Syndrome come out. And the China Syndrome was on everybody's mind when TMI happened. TMI did not hurt anyone. TMI was an economic disaster for the company, but everything was held within the pressurized water reactor and specifically in the container that the reactor sits in. So they melted the core. Great economic loss, but hurt nobody. So this
was 3 Mile Island.
3 Mile Island.
So literally the one of the largest, most notable, like, oh my gosh, nuclear meltdown. It's like, yeah, nobody got hurt. They lost a lot of money. Nobody got hurt.
In the United States, that's the only one we've had like that. Now, you fast forward to 1985, and Chernobyl hit. So Chernobyl was an RBMK reactor designed by the Soviet Union. It was in the Ukraine. And the Chernobyl reactor, in its operating manual, it's very specific. It states, do not operate below 30%. So the operators in the Ukraine, for reasons known only to them, they decided to find out what would happen if you operated below 30%. We all now know the results. I
And
happen.
that's that when you, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Go
when you
ahead.
say 30%, that's 30% energy production, correct?
30% power.
Now, that would be relevant because part of the energy production process is you have this huge heat source and you use that heat source to heat up something that then goes and either directly spins a turbine, as you have with boiling water reactors where you literally have water turning into steam and that turns a steam, or you have something, a thermo transfer, right? So you have pressurized water reactors where it's like, okay, I'm heating up this water and that water doesn't get to expand. I keep it under pressure. It's going to be really, really hot. And we're going to move that and we're going to have a heat exchange system where you have these boiling hot pipes that are still water on the inside and you make them interact with water that can then expand and spin the turbine.
And that's the way essentially all of them are.
Great.
And that's the way the RBMK reactor was.
And if you do not allow the heat to be captured and moved away and cooled, because essentially what happens is when you have that heat exchange where you have the pressurized water running across the cold water that turns into steam, then you can't get rid of the heat, right? Because you have heat being created from the nuclear rods and the fuel. Is that
Right.
accurate?
The RBMK reactor is the Soviet Union built 10 of them.
Okay.
They were made simply to produce fuel for them to use in their nuclear weapons program.
Okay.
And it was a cheap way to do it.
Okay.
Cheap reactor, cheap way to do it. But to remove the thermal heat that was generated, they needed to get rid of it. How do they get rid of it? They simply put, as you just described, a steam system on it to drive a steam turbine, which in turn drove a generator. So the only reason that they had a power plant associated with
It's
it
just to get rid of
remove the
excess
heat.
thermal.
Remove the heat. That's it.
Gotcha. And so if you stop removing the heat, or if you reduce the power demand and essentially say like, okay, let's run less cold water over this because let's slow down the turbine, then you have excess thermal buildup.
Which is what happened in 3 Mile Island. But 3 Mile Island also, when the reactor physics, when they designed them, they designed them and they knew that below 30%.
You said 3 Mile Island. Did you mean Chernobyl?
I meant Chernobyl.
Okay, great. That's what happened in Chernobyl.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Chernobyl was, the design was such that they were driven by the head of the Soviet Union to build these reactors to make fuel. So they knew that below 30% operating power, that they were unstable. They didn't have the controls that were necessary, such as we have in the United States and the rest of the world has. So right there in their manual, it said, do not operate below 30%. Now, you can operate below 30%, obviously, when you're going up in power or you're going down in power to shut it down. But do not operate.
Don't hold it at like 20%.
That's right. Do not operate. But they did. And what happened was, they had the instability, they had the heat, and between the instability and the excess heat, the reactor came apart because it was cheaply built without a containment like we've been doing in the Western world. So we had the Chernobyl accident. That accident was caused by the operators.
Now, mind you, in the Soviet Union at this time, a breakdown of a reactor of this nature, it's like there were a lot of things, but their industrial farming mechanisms were breaking down, their transportations were like, there was no industry in Russia that was, like humming along hunky, like they didn't have an effective GM where it's like, oh yeah, this is like Russia's Detroit and like everybody's getting rich and everything's going so well because it was the Soviet Union and they were rushing things and, the design and safety precautions were not there.
They were devoted to building military hardware from one side to the other. It was military hardware. The people in the country came second. Now, they did have oil. They did have uranium. They also, in 1957, as part of their nuclear weapons program, they had excess material that they needed to get rid of, true waste. So in the Ural Mountains, they had some caves that had been made by mining. So these caves and this underground that was made by mining, they used to take and pour, literally pour, whatever the nuclear waste was down in those holes. Well, by 1957, the material was in various cracks and crevices down there, and water got down there. And they wound up going what we call prompt critical. Instantly, 1,200 miles along the Urals were contaminated. There was a city there of something like 70 or 90,000 people that they needed to get them out of there right away, in which they didn't. So a whole bunch of people were exposed. I'm not so sure that we really know how many were exposed or how many died. But that's what you get when you dig down into our geology and you don't really know what it is, and what you're putting down there, you don't really make sure that it's packaged in such a way that it will survive the packaging. And we've got people here in the United States that are proposing to do the same thing right now, which I think will be part of a future podcast.
Okay, so at this point, we've covered 3 Mile. No loss of life, loss of a lot of money. Okay. We have a failure of a Soviet Union reactor, not the only one they built, but one that was operated out of stated operating guidelines, and you got what you got. What about Fukushima?
Fukushima Daiichi, I received a call 3 hours after the tsunami hit Fukushima Daiichi. And the call was from the senior nuclear safety person in Japan. He had been at the International Atomic Energy Agency the same time I was. And at the International Atomic Energy Agency, when I got there in early 1989, there were 105 member nations. Each one had an office. Not everyone was involved in nuclear, but because they signed up as members and it was part of the United Nations, they had offices. Japan had an office, but Japan had nuclear power, and they had an aggressive nuclear power program. As an island nation, they needed to import all their energy. To get away from importing energy, they were going nuclear power, and their intention was to be powered mostly by nuclear in 30 years.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
When you say Japan was importing their energy, does that mean that they literally had contracts for natural gas, for coal, for oil? So they don't have an oil industry.
Nope.
They don't have a robust coal mine industry.
Nope.
They don't have natural gas.
They had some coal.
Okay.
But not much.
Okay.
So you really have to group in that Western Pacific, you have to group 4 nations or 5 or 4 together. And that was South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Okay. They don't have any natural energy resources. Not really. So they had to import everything that they did. They had to import everything for energy. They had to import everything for materials. I tell people to study those 4 countries from World War II to present day, or World War II to, say, 1985, because they were able to take their people and educate them and go out into the rest of the world and find energy sources, import them into those countries, and make them into a powerhouse of being able to bring in raw materials, produce things, and export them to the world. Very successful. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. Japan was going nuclear, and they were well underway when the tsunami hit. So I get this call. He describes to me what had happened at Fukushima Daiichi. And so I'm listening to him, and he's pretty clear about what they were seeing. What I didn't know is they had a particular camera set up to observe all of them from the ocean side, which he later gave me access to, which I had on my computer at home. So here were my first few words: water, water, water. He said, even salt water? I said, even salt water. He said, we're worried about the cores. If what you told me is true, the cores are gone. Water, water, water. So I'll make a long story short. Over the next 3 days, I was on the phone with him a lot. I had access to this camera, and on a Saturday morning, I saw this explosion from unit number 1. And as I'm watching it, I'm saying to myself, there's something called what we call a Zerk water reaction. And I thought, it's not a Zerk water reaction because it's not large enough. It turned out to be a hydrogen explosion. They had cross-connected the ventilation systems of a couple of those plants. And while I knew about those plants and the design, there was a number of things that I didn't know at the time. One of them was when they were, just after they were built, General Electric came out with a change to the top of the dome, which acted as the safeguard from both radiation leaking out and something hitting it to try to damage the reactor. And the modification was that if there was some sort of an accident and there was hydrogen produced, this ventilation duct would open up and would vent the hydrogen. The Japanese never made that change. So the hydrogen accumulated, and you get the right hydrogen air mixture, and that was the explosion.
And when you say unit 1, is that that's one particular
They had
reactor?
six. They had 6 reactors, of which 4 were down closer to the water.
Okay, great. And when the tsunami hit, that knocked out the structures and
Of the 4.
of the 4. So you had 2 of the remaining reactors were still operating.
They were above, and they could have been operated, but they shut them all down.
Okay.
Now, then what I found out about the 4 that were damaged, Japan decided they're into efficiency. They design everything for efficiency, and that's ingrained in them because they have no energy source. So whether they're designing something that's a power plant, they're designing something to build something, it's about efficiency. It's why they have the cars today that they have and we don't. So when you go buy a Toyota versus a Chevrolet, Toyota's going to last longer.
Yeah, but boy, those Tahoes look cool.
The Tahoes do, and I like them.
One passed me. This was, I was coming back from the eastern side of the state. It was all black, tinted windows. It had the new white license plate, the black and white. I was like, oh my God. Here I am in my Highlander.
I have a Ford pickup, and I've had Ford pickups since 1967. But I have to tell you, my next vehicle is going to be something like one of those. But going back to Japan, that's okay. Going back to Japan. So when the plants were being designed and built, and the site was being prepared for the plants, in order to be more efficient with the cooling water system that was coming from the ocean to provide cooling water, and you have to pump it through the heat exchangers to the cooling towers that cool the steam coming off the condensers underneath the turbines, they decided to cut the land away and move it down closer to the water. Big mistake. So those 4 plants are located closer to the sea level than the other 2 plants.
So they don't have to spend as much time and energy.
They don't have to spend as much money.
To the heat exchange, turns into steam, and then they cool everything off. And
so it was a matter of efficiency. So yes, they did save money for many years. But the result was the tsunami, they were low enough, the tsunami hit them and went inside of them, went inside their diesel generators, and destroyed everything. Shortly thereafter, I got an invitation to Japan. I took 2 people with me. Among them were 2 people that between them and myself, there's nothing they don't know about nuclear power. We didn't know about nuclear power. We spent 10 days there, and that should be the subject of another discussion.
With 3 Mile Island, no loss of life, loss of money. With Chernobyl, clear poor manufacturing, poor operation, the whole bit. And even if you want to say it's not manufacturing, it's obviously don't start your car from a dead stop in design. 5th gear. Yeah, right.
It was a design.
Right. With Fukushima, what was the fallout of that?
There were people exposed. There was the person who had been the manager was died of stress. He had a heart attack. I don't know all the results from there, but it was not much. It was amazing for the damage that was done, and those were boiling water reactors, by the way.
Okay, so those produce steam directly from the interaction with the fuel rods and the water. That steam directly goes up into
the turbine spin turbines.
Generator.
Yeah. So all of those were breached. All of those were broken open. For this podcast, let's not talk too much about it, but I will tell you that while I was there, I wanted to go up on top of number 4. The reason and they didn't want me to go up on top of number 4 because it was too hot. Radiologically, it was too hot. I wanted to go up on number 4 because we had the anti-nuclear industry in the United States saying that number 4 was going to tip over into the Pacific Ocean, and it was going to cause radionuclides to go around the northern hemisphere, and everybody in the northern hemisphere was going to have to move to the southern hemisphere. My view was great, because people like myself will stay up in the northern hemisphere while you guys are gone, and we'll take advantage of everything that's here.
Oh my God.
But I wanted to be on top of number 4. I wanted to be able to say that I was on top of number 4. Now, I did have the Japanese, I had them have somebody with me with a radiological instrument that I could read what the dose was of the radiation at the time. And I must tell you, on top of number 4, it was a little hot.
A little hot.
But I wasn't up there very long. And the 2 people that went with me from here, they were up there also.
Wait, so you did go up there? The Japanese didn't want you? Like,
oh,
no,
they
take a picture. Here I go.
That's right. For several days, they tried for me not to go up there. But I said, I'm going on top of number 4.
That brings us in again. I don't want to. I really want to make sure that we cover, have a conclusive kind of end to all of these episodes. We've been at it for almost an hour. We have our 3 large, very very notable issues that people are concerned about, and the creation of an entire industry that is designed, or at least was designed at its inception, and propagated for some time by international interests that do not want the United States to continue becoming powerful. Now, notably, they have not taken that advice either, right? Like, the world didn't stop investing in nuclear energy and research when the United States stopped. That's accurate, correct?
That's correct.
So the Russian and Chinese counterparts are like, all right, they're not doing anything, but that has nothing to do with us.
You bet. And they have continued. And something that we'll talk about in detail in another episode is in 1995, there was something called the BAT Agreement between the Secretary of Energy and the governor of Idaho, Phil Batt. The BAT Agreement has been in place since 1995. When it was first created, a bunch of us thought, this is ludicrous. But they did it anyway. But it was driven by anti-nuclear people. And that's how it came about. Now, it's been modified a number of times, including recently, but it's not gone away. But what it did do was it hindered progress. It was just one of the ways at which there was to hinder progress in commercial nuclear power in the United States and help Russia and China. So right here in Idaho, for the last 30 years, the BAT Agreement has been in place, and it's helped Russia and China, and it's hurt the United States.
Richard, why don't we do this? Why don't we call it for today?
Okay.
I think we covered a lot of the back history about where we are at this point and what people are predominantly concerned about, the 3 major incidents you talked about. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I just know that being in this industry since 1963, it's safe. I wouldn't have operated the reactors. I wouldn't have been involved in maintaining the reactors I wouldn't have been in reactor compartments. I wouldn't have been on top of unit number 4 in Japan if I didn't know this was a safe industry. It is a very safe industry, and it's only being considered by some to not be safe because the continued work by the activists, the anti-nuclear industry, that's trying to make people think it's not safe, and it is safe.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for kicking off this nuclear series with me. I was excited coming into this. I'm more excited now. So we're going to try to kick these out every single week. And man, God willing, over the next 6 months, we'll have the greatest nuclear education collection in the United States. So,
well, I appreciate what you're doing. And since I know you come at this from an educator's point of view, you are ideal to do this. And so you've got my support, and I can also bring in some other people to help you. Not the least of which is over the next month, there is somebody visiting with me who is a woman who's been in this business for 45 years. She has been the chief operator in charge of a 1,000-megawatt nuclear reactor down in Texas, and one of the brightest people I know in the nuclear industry. And I haven't asked her yet, but I'm going to show her one of your podcasts, and I'm going to ask her, would she come in and do a podcast for you while she's here?
I trust you to work your magic. I want her in here.
Okay.
God bless you, Richard. Let's do this again. And yeah, we'll just kick it off next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.